Learn English through Stories K3 PDF. Adapted and modified by Kulwant Singh Sandhu. Contents: Unlighted Lamps. Part 3. Unlighted Lamps. Part 3. By Sherwood Anderson. Mary sat by a window in the doctor's office awaiting his return. So absorbed was she in her own thoughts that she was unconscious of the voice of Duke Yetter talking with the men in the street. When Duke had come into the street, the hot anger of the early part of the evening had returned, and she again saw him advancing toward her in the orchard with the look of arrogant male confidence in his eyes, but presently she forgot him and thought only of her father. An incident of her childhood returned to haunt her. One afternoon in the month of May when she was 15, her father had asked her to accompany him on an evening drive into the country. The doctor went to visit a sick woman at a farmhouse 5 miles from town, and as there had been a great deal of rain, the roads were heavy. It was dark when they reached the farmer's house, and they went into the kitchen and ate cold food off a kitchen table. For some reason her father had, on that evening, appeared boyish and almost gay. On the road he had talked a little. Even at that early age Mary had grown tall, and her figure was becoming womanly. After the cold supper in the farm kitchen he walked with her around the house, and she sat on a narrow porch. For a moment her father stood before her. He put his hands into his trouser pockets and throwing back his head laughed almost heartily. "It seems strange to think you will soon be a woman," he said. "When you do become a woman, what do you suppose is going to happen? What kind of a life will you lead? What will happen to you?" The doctor sat on the porch beside the child, and for a moment she had thought he was about to put his arm around her. Then he jumped up and went into the house, leaving her to sit alone in the darkness. As she remembered the incident, Mary remembered also that on that evening of her childhood she had met her father's advances in silence. It seemed to her that she, not her father, was to blame for the life they had led together. The farm laborer she had met on the bridge had not felt her father's coldness. That was because he had himself been warm and generous in his attitude toward the man who had cared for him in his hour of sickness and misfortune. Her father had said that the laborer knew how to be a father, and Mary remembered with what warmth the 2 boys fishing by the creek had called to her as she went away into the darkness. "Their father has known how to be a father because his children have known how to give themselves," she thought guiltily. She also would give herself. Before the night had passed, she would do that. On that evening, long ago, and as she rode home beside her father, he had made another unsuccessful effort to break through the wall that separated them. The heavy rains had swollen the streams they had to cross, and when they had almost reached town, he had stopped the horse on a wooden bridge. The horse danced nervously about, and her father held the reins firmly and occasionally spoke to him. Beneath the bridge, the swollen stream made a great roaring sound, and beside the road in a long flat field, there was a lake of flood water. At that moment, the moon had come out from behind clouds, and the wind that blew across the water made little waves. The lake of flood water was covered with dancing lights. "I'm going to tell you about your mother and myself," her father said huskily, but at that moment the timbers of the bridge began to crack dangerously, and the horse plunged forward. When her father had regained control of the frightened beast, they were in the streets of the town, and his diffident, silent nature had reasserted itself. Mary sat in the darkness by the office window and saw her father drive into the street. When his horse had been put away, he did not, as was his custom, come at once up the stairway to the office, but lingered in the darkness before the barn door. Once he started to cross the street and then returned into the darkness. Among the men who for 2 hours had been sitting and talking quietly, a quarrel broke out. Jack Fisher, the town night watchman, had been telling the others the story of a battle in which he had fought during the Civil War, and Duke Yetter had begun bantering him. The night watchman grew angry. Grasping his nightstick, he limped up and down. The loud voice of Duke Yetter cut across the shrill, angry voice of the victim of his wit. "You ought to have flanked the fellow. I tell you, Jack, yes sir, you ought to have flanked that Reb, and then when you got him flanked, you ought to have knocked the stuffings out of the cuss. That's what I would have done," Duke shouted, laughing boisterously. "You would have raised hell, you would," the night watchman answered, filled with ineffectual wrath. The old soldier went off along the street, followed by the laughter of Duke. And his companions and Barney Smithfield, having put the doctor's horse away, came out and closed the barn door. A lantern hanging above the door swung back and forth. Dr. Cochran again started across the street, and when he had reached the foot of the stairway turned and shouted to the men. "Good night," he called cheerfully. A strand of hair was blown by the light summer breeze across Mary's cheek, and she jumped to her feet as though she had been touched by a hand reached out to her from the darkness. 100 times she had seen her father return from drives in the evening, but never before had he said anything at all to the loiterers by the barn door. She became half convinced that not her father but some other man was now coming up the stairway. The heavy, dragging footsteps rang loudly on the wooden stairs, and Mary heard her father set down the little square medicine case he always carried. The strange, cheerful, hearty mood of the man continued, but his mind was in a confused riot. Mary imagined she could see his dark form in the doorway. "The woman has had a baby," said the hearty voice from the landing outside the door. "Who did that happen to? Was it Ellen, or that other woman, or my little Mary?" A stream of words, a protest, came from the man's lips. "Who's been having a baby? I want to know. Who's been having a baby? Life doesn't work out. Why are babies always being born?" he asked. A laugh broke from the doctor's lips, and his daughter leaned forward and gripped the arms of her chair. "A babe that's been born," he said again. "It's strange, that my hands should have helped a baby be born while all the time death stood at my elbow." Dr. Cochran stamped upon the floor of the landing. "My feet are cold and numb from waiting for life to come out of life," he said heavily. "The woman struggled, and now I must struggle." Silence followed the stamping of feet and the tired, heavy declaration from the sick man's lips. From the street below came another loud shout of laughter from Duke Yetter. And then Dr. Cochran fell backward down the narrow stairs to the street. There was no cry from him, just the clatter of his shoes upon the stairs and the terrible subdued sound of the body falling. Mary did not move from her chair. With closed eyes she waited. Her heart pounded. A weakness complete and overmastering had possession of her, and from feet to head ran little waves of feeling, as though tiny creatures with soft hair like feet were playing upon her body. It was Duke Yetter who carried the dead man up the stairs and laid him on a bed in one of the rooms back of the office. One of the men who had been sitting with him before the door of the barn followed, lifting his hands and dropping them nervously. Between his fingers he held a forgotten cigarette, the light from which danced up and down in the darkness.